The explosion happened miles up the river, but at Point Lookout, prisoners could still hear it. That's not folklore. That's recorded fact. The sound of a warship tearing itself apart, carrying across the water to men locked inside the deadliest prison camp of the Civil War. This is Point Lookout Lighthouse, on the southern tip of Maryland, widely called the most haunted lighthouse in America. And to understand why, you have to understand what happened on this exact stretch of land more than a century and a half ago. The lighthouse itself came first, and peacefully. Built in 1830, at the point where the Potomac River meets the Chesapeake Bay. For decades, it did exactly what lighthouses do. It warned ships away from the shoals, nothing more. A lighthouse keeper's family lived inside it, tending the lamp through the night, logging ship traffic, raising children in rooms that would later become the most reported on square footage of the entire property. None of them had any reason to think their home would outlive their names by 2 centuries. If you'd stood on this point before 1861, you'd have found a quiet resort, beach cottages, a wharf, vacationers escaping the summer heat of Washington and Baltimore. Then the war came, and it didn't just pass through. It consumed the place entirely. In 1862, the Union government leased this land and began building Hammond General Hospital. Completed the following year, its wards arranged like spokes radiating out from a central hub, built to hold roughly 1,400 patients at once. It opened into a crisis already in motion. 1 month after Hammond took its first patients, more than 12,000 men fell wounded at Fredericksburg alone. A volunteer nurse named Catherine Prescott Wormley described what those weeks felt like from the inside. Ships arriving with hundreds of new patients a day, more than the wards could absorb. Exhausted men mistaken at a glance for the merely sick. "Every man who falls exhausted from its ranks is sent to us," she wrote. Imagine being on the receiving end of that sentence, not knowing, as each new boat docked, whether it carried 50 men or 500. The hospital even printed its own newspaper, the Hammond Gazette, written by patients and staff for patients and staff. The first paper of its kind, published out of a military hospital in the entire war. A strange, almost domestic detail tucked inside all of this. Men setting type and swapping stories inside a building that was, at the same time, absorbing the worst the war could produce. Then came Gettysburg, in July of 1863. The flood of Confederate prisoners that followed was more than existing Union prison camps could hold. So within weeks, the Army began building something new on the same stretch of land, right beside the hospital. A prison. Camp Hoffman was designed to hold 10,000 men. By 1864, it held more than 20,000 at once. Sit with that gap for a second. Double the intended capacity, and climbing. Between 1863 and 1865, more than 52,000 Confederate prisoners passed through this camp in total. If you'd been one of them, you wouldn't have found a building waiting for you. You'd have found a stretch of open, sandy ground, barely above sea level, and a canvas tent. That was the shelter. That was all of it. The tents themselves were never designed for the numbers assigned to them. Most held 4 to 6 men in space built for far fewer, on ground that flooded with every hard rain, with no wood flooring between the men and the wet sand beneath them. In summer, you'd have baked under direct sun with nowhere to escape it, mosquitoes thick enough to feel like a physical weight in the evening air. In winter, you'd have felt the wind come straight off the water, with nothing between you and it but canvas, the cold settling into your hands until you couldn't tell if they were still yours. The water itself wasn't safe either. Wells near the camp were contaminated. Food arrived spoiled more often than not, and by mid-1863, rationing here had tightened further. A deliberate policy shift after prisoner exchanges between North and South broke down. Whatever the reasoning in Washington, the math landed the same way it always does. on the men actually holding the tin cups. And disease moved through a camp like this the way it always does, fast and without discrimination. Typhoid, smallpox. Historians estimate somewhere between roughly 3,500 and 4,000 men died at Camp Hoffman, from disease, from exposure, from the simple grinding math of overcrowding, with nowhere near enough resources to support it. Now picture just one of them. You're a soldier who's already survived actual combat, already lived through the thing that was supposed to be the worst part. You're marched into this camp expecting, maybe, a roof. Instead, you're handed a strip of canvas and a patch of sand. You'd learn the water made you sick before you learned anyone's name. You'd watch the man in the next tent stop getting up one morning and understand, before anyone told you, what that meant. You wouldn't know if you'd see the following winter. Most days, you'd have no way of knowing if the war outside these fences was even still being fought. Some of you did survive. Most of you did, technically. Over 52,000 passed through, and the deaths, tragic as they were a fraction of that total. But surviving this camp and coming through it unchanged were two very different things. Then, in November of 1864, something happened that even the prisoners couldn't ignore. A Union gunboat called the USS Tulip had been running with a known mechanical fault, a boiler its own engineers had been explicitly warned not to use. On November 11th, running that boiler anyway to avoid becoming a slow target along the riverbank, the Tulip's engine tore itself apart in a single catastrophic blast. Of the 57 men aboard, only a handful survived. The explosion was heard for miles up the Potomac, including, according to historical accounts, at the prison camp itself. Imagine that sound reaching you inside Camp Hoffman, a distant, violent crack rolling across the water, and no way to know what it was, or how many more of you it meant were about to die somewhere out of sight. By 1865, the war ended, and the camp emptied out. 20,000 men, gone from this peninsula in a matter of weeks. The hospital closed not long after. The land went quiet again. But quiet, at Point Lookout, apparently didn't mean empty. Here's what's harder to dismiss than any ghost story. When prisoners died at Camp Hoffman, many were buried in graves near the lighthouse grounds, close enough that later, as the coastline eroded, the remains had to be relocated entirely, moved to protect them from a shoreline that was slowly reclaiming the ground they'd been laid in. Even in death, this stretch of land wouldn't quite let them stay still. Maybe that's the real reason the lighthouse won't stay quiet either. None of what follows is documented the way that burial record is documented. It's testimony, collected over decades, from investigators and residents with no obvious reason to make it up, and no way to prove it either. Treat it exactly that way. In 1980, the paranormal researcher Hans Holzer, one of the first people to take this kind of investigation seriously as a discipline rather than a ghost story, brought recording equipment into the lighthouse itself. His team documented 24 separate voices and sounds during that investigation, male voices, female voices, none with a source anyone could locate in the room. Laura Berg lived at the lighthouse in the 1970s, working for the state. She described waking one night to 6 unexplained lights hovering in her darkened bedroom. She described a phantom voice calling out a name, her mother's name, on a night her mother was staying with her, in a house with no one else inside it. She said she never felt threatened by any of it, just watched. Others who've spent time in the building describe the apparition of a woman in a long blue skirt, moving calmly through the halls. Some who've researched the site connect her to Ann Davis, the wife of one of the lighthouse's earliest keepers, a woman who by all accounts considered this building her home, long after most people would have stopped calling it that. 24 voices on a tape, a name called out with no one there to call it, a woman in blue who never seems to leave. None of it proves anything. But none of it happened in a vacuum either. It happened in a building that sat, for 3 of the worst years in American history, at the exact center of more suffering than most places see in a century. 3,500 to 4,000 men, by conservative estimate, never left this peninsula. Some were buried here more than once. And whatever you make of the reported voices, the unexplained lights, the woman in the blue skirt, the actual, documented history underneath all of it doesn't need embellishing to be disturbing. A resort town turned into the deadliest prison camp of the Civil War, on a strip of sand most of its prisoners couldn't have found on a map before they arrived. A keeper's home that outlasted the war, the camp, and nearly every name connected to either one. Maybe the reason this particular lighthouse keeps getting called back to, by researchers, by park employees, by people who never planned on believing any of this, isn't the voices at all. Maybe it's that the ground underneath them never really settled. Not literally, not figuratively. Just a place that absorbed more than it was ever built to hold, and has been quietly giving small pieces of it back ever since. So if you're ever standing at the base of that lighthouse, at the edge of that quiet water, and the wind shifts just slightly colder than it should, what do you think you'd actually be feeling? History, or something that never quite finished leaving?